Thank you for the kind introduction. I need to ask, I guess, add a German institution to my CV. Professor Weiler, thank you very much for the kind invitation, as well as to the National German Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. This is such an honor for me to be here. So thank you, and I'm going to be talking, as was mentioned, identifying opportunities in a global health challenges, a perspective from Pfizer's. So this was already mentioned. I'm on a leave of absence, and this is also some of my disclosures. So I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 challenges and the journey, perhaps to remind us. I think all of us went through this process. And back in 2019, of course, in December, the first identification and emerging that was reported in China, that led to January 31st in 2020, where the WHO declared this as a global health emergency. And that led, as we heard in March, was when we had all the borders being sealed, schools closed, masking and distancing mandates that had been started. This was also the time in April where a million cases of COVID-19 was reported worldwide. And in June, these infections started to go down, but then again, when things started to reopen a little bit, we saw how that really, in fact, bounded back where the rates started to go up. So in July of 2020 also was the large scale of testing of vaccines that had begun. And there was, by September of 2020, we had reached already 1 million deaths worldwide. And then subsequently, the remarkable thing is in December of 2020, in US and UK was the first to approve under emergency use authorization the Pfizer-BioNTech, which was the first vaccine that was approved to address this pandemic. And then that was also the time when we started to come through these variants of concern of the virus that were being identified. And in January, that was when the vaccines became more available to first responders and also to those that are vulnerable, as we heard, those that are above the age of 65 and older. This was also the time when we reached the 2 million deaths worldwide. In July, that was when we heard about Delta, the Delta variant that was found in many countries, 65 countries worldwide. By September of 2021, we reached 4.5 million deaths worldwide. In October, this is also another thing for the US, we had surpassed already what the flu, as we heard in the pandemic 100 years ago in 1918, we had surpassed that. And in November, WHO had declared that Omicron as the new variant of concern, and now we have, in fact, as of January of this year, of 2022, Omicron variant pretty much is what is now the new case and pretty much the majority, if not all of the cases that we are seeing. By May in US, we reached the 1 million deaths related to COVID-19. September, 3.6 billion vaccine of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine was manufactured and distributed. And more recently, this month, in fact, in September, under emergency use authorization, US and EU recommended a booster, which is the bivalent, which has the wild type as well as the Omicron subvariant for ages 12 and older. I'll take you a little bit of the journey, what it was like at Pfizer. This is also why it was successful, was important to really have that partnership between Pfizer and BioNTech. That was started from the call, the letter of intent that was signed was in March of 2020. But, however, I want to highlight that actually Pfizer and BioNTech already had a relationship 2 years prior, and they were working. In fact, the initial work was to address the flu using the mRNA platform, but then that was pivoted when this pandemic hit. In May was the first in human, so this was really done at a speed, what we call a light speed project, where we had phase 1 and 2 readout in July. By July already of the same year, the pivotal study was started. By October, we also started for our adolescents, the 12 to 15-year-old. And then by November already, the exciting part where the readout, the efficacy and safety was reported in this pivotal trial. And that was also, that led to our EUA submission. And December, as I mentioned, both in UK, in US, and then subsequently also in EU, was approved under emergency use authorization. So this was really a miracle if we think about in terms of how we do drug development and in the vaccines. But there is another remarkable journey that needs to be told, which is that part of manufacturing. Usually we wait until we see the results of the pivotal studies before we start to manufacture and do. Now we have to also remember this is a platform for which the manufacturing was not prepared. We're looking more like a bench, we're looking more of a laboratory, but now we need to upscale it. So interestingly here you'll see that the first phone call to our product's global supply in fact was made exactly also in March at the beginning of when this was being planned. So in June, and also because the mRNA is not as stable, because it needed to have freezers, it is incredible. It was, in fact, if you look at some of these pictures, was to increase this type in order to reach worldwide manufacturing, to have that supply. It meant to having farm freezers of this -80. I think for the scientists, you will know when you pass the universities, you'll see these -80. But at Pfizer, it was also important to build this, and sometimes there wasn't even space for it, but it needed to be accommodated. So going from a bench type of work, that was laboratory, to really upscale it into a clinical material that could reach patients and individuals. So the first, in fact, regulatory authorization as it was happening, this was also being upscaled so that as soon as the EUA was given, in December, in fact, the shipment was made. This is also something that usually is not done, but we were faced with an impossible situation that required these types of innovation as well in the manufacturing. So the journey of the development of Comirnaty or the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, also we were faced, as we heard, about equity. So it was important also for us to work with organizations such as COVAX, making agreements. That was done in January of 2021. At the same time, you can imagine so many things going on because the variants of concern continued to happen, this mutation. So it needed also to think, we also needed to think how to address that. So there were booster studies also that were being planned, ongoing, and then we also needed to protect our children. So this was also meant to, studies needed to be also carefully done in those that are infants, here in this case, as is shown here back in March. And then the US FDA as well as EU approved under emergency use authorization again in May of 2021 for the adolescent. That followed, if you look at this scale, I don't know if my pointer works, but back, oh yes, in June of this year, then we have the 6 months to 4 years as well. By December, we had shipped 2.3 billion in 2021, and I'll come back to where we are. Another important thing was, like, how do we really increase this manufacturing and increase access from our perspective? It was important for us to work with manufacturing sites that are outside, which is that can serve the population. So one of them was done, as you'll see here, is Europharma, which is actually an agreement made in Brazil in August of 2021 in Latin America. And then the agreement in January of 2022 was also an agreement with a manufacturing site in South Africa, the BioVac, so that they can manufacture the same vaccine. It is hard to tell, in terms of what these vaccines have done in terms of preventing the hospitalization and death, although one cannot really come with an accurate number. There are many studies that have been published now to really estimate. There are many models to say, like, how many lives have been really impacted by this vaccine in averting, particularly those that are vulnerable from succumbing to this disease, whether it's hospitalization or having a severe disease that leads to death. Now where we are is moving forward. We still have the challenge of the mutating virus. So we have the Omicron variant. It's not only the Omicron variant, we have even the subvariant, which is now, we have moved from the BA.1 to BA.4/5. What is important also about this platform, what we've learned, I think, really going back to that 2020, making a decision that this is the kind of vaccine that we're going to start to work on, is that what we've learned is that this mRNA platform is adaptable, which means that we can quickly, how do we get really ahead? Because the problem is that by the time you have the variants, is you need to really be ahead of that. And this platform did offer that in terms of how we can really scale up and how we can also come up with these bivalent or different types of formulations of the same vaccine. So in fact, in August last month, the FDA granted an EUA for a booster that has a bivalent, which is the wild type, and then it has the Omicron subvariant that would address the 4 and 5. And then I've listed here in September the EMA and CHMP recommendations that were made for both the BA1 as well as the BA4-5 for individuals greater or equal to 12 years. So I think the other thing is also what we've learned with this challenge is it wasn't enough that we are adapting these and then trying to address this, as I mentioned, is we want to be ahead. We want to understand where the science can take us. We want to really focus on the science. So that's something that where we are working now also is to look at next generation SARS-CoV-2 spike antigen. So we have the phase 1 and 2 that has been initiated with the bivalent candidate. And this is in order to increase the stability, means that can we have this vaccine that could last, the immunity could last for longer, and by exposing more of these neutralization sensitive epitopes, we could cover multiple variants. Another important proof of concept study that we are planning also is to look at pan-SARS-CoV-2 vaccine candidate that would cover across multiple variant. So as of September of this year, unfortunately, we've had, in US, we've passed already that 1 million death, and worldwide, more than 6 million, as was reported by the WHO. And there, at the same time, there have been also many billions of vaccines that have been administered worldwide. Yet we are still facing the challenge. I think there has been significant, as we heard with the vaccine, certainly has had quite an impact, and we continue to work on that. But one thing that we also have learned is that we need also to understand this virus, again, going to the science, that not only is it that we would have preventative, but we also need to think about therapies for those that could not respond, those who could not get the vaccine for whatever the reason might be, or for those who, for whatever reason also when the vaccine is not working because there is a variant, because there is mutation, because the virus has been able to evade the host immune system, we need to think of ways also to treat those who really are infected with the SARS-CoV-2. So I think for the virologist, this is very simplified view of how the virus enters the body. And as you know, viruses really hijack the host immune response, the host cell, because it's a single-stranded RNA. It has a genetic code, but really needs the machinery of the host. And that's what happens with this virus. It enters, it has ways of entering. We talk about the ACE receptor, the spike antigen. And so it gets into the cell, and there is several steps for which hijacks the host, as I mentioned, this machinery to make the proteins that are necessary for it to replicate and infect many more other cells. So for us, in terms of putting our scientists together, the decision was made that we would try to inhibit, there is this what is called the main protease. So it's a protease, which is an enzyme that cleaves or cuts this peptide, because that single-stranded RNA makes these long protein. There's 2 long proteins that are translated, and then those need to be chopped into these little peptides that can really then are very important for the function, for the replication of the virus, for the survival of the virus, for infecting other cells. So our group, our team of scientists, decided that we would try to find a target to block that protease, because if we can block that protease, that enzyme that cleaves this, we can prevent this virus from replicating. So that was the reason. And that was also another remarkable thing. So as we were doing the vaccine, all that was going on, there was also another group of scientists working on this. Back, in fact, in March of 2020, when this original design was being planned. And so what our scientists came up was with the target for this main protease called nirmatrelvir. And that also had its own light speed journey in this time, and this scale shows here where we started, in fact, the first synthesis of nirmatrelvir. This is the active ingredient that really inhibits that protease that I was talking about. And that was done also in 2020 in July. And here it shows how quickly also the phase studies were started. There was a phase 3 study was started in July, and we submitted for EUA, and by December of 2021, nirmatrelvir is, as I mentioned, is one of the ingredients. It's combined with ritonavir, so it's called Paxlovid. Paxlovid is the drug that is used to treat, and I'll come back to it, but it has two components. However, ritonavir, which is used in HIV, does not have activity against SARS-CoV-2. It is combined here in order to help, because the liver, our liver will try to get rid of nirmatrelvir, because that's a normal way how we process the drugs in this case. So the ritonavir actually inhibits that enzyme in our liver so it can stay. This is more of a pharmacology to make it last longer, so you can only take it twice a day instead of taking it so many more times. And I'll come back to the results of Paxlovid. This is the study. We call it EPIC-HR because it's in high-risk individuals. This is a trial where we had, and it describes here in the table, which is basically is patients or that have been, in this case we are not preventing, so these are patients. These are subjects, individuals, patients who have been infected with SARS-CoV-2, and they would take Paxlovid or placebo, and then we would continue to follow them and see in terms of the outcome, primary outcome for us, endpoints where what we wanted to look at is, does Paxlovid prevent hospitalization and death in high-risk individuals, in the individuals who would be at really high risk for death and hospitalization. And what the final analysis showed from this study, from this pivotal study, was there was 89% reduction in COVID-19 related hospitalization and death in these high-risk patients when compared to placebo, if it is taken 3 days at the symptom onset. So you have to test by PCR as well. And then if you take it at 5 days, there is also 89% reduction. So that is a remarkable achievement as well. So what are the lessons that are learned and what are the challenges? How can we turn these challenges into opportunities? And so we talk about light speed journey. And the light speed journey or mindset, it's not only like how fast you need to go, but it's also important that we change our culture, we change our way of working, because we did learn, we had to work very different in order to approach this pandemic. But as you know, there are many diseases that we are still faced that we need to really learn from that pandemic, that we can apply them as well to all the other diseases. So the urgency here in COVID-19 pandemic that has challenged us, we started to think differently. Initially, our goal, these are our corporate purpose blueprint. We focus on our science, as I mentioned, to deliver first class of science, unleash the power of our people. Without our talent, we don't have anything. It's very important to really grow that talent and that experts, but it was also important for us to lead the conversation. As we heard, this communication is very important. Transform our go-market, like how do we reach patients? How do we reach individuals? And then the other thing is we had to leverage, because remember, this is a pandemic where we could not really even recruit like we used to, because things are blocked. You know, as we heard, schools, hospitals, etc. So we needed to really use our digital system. So we need to transform ways how we work through digital. So internally, we referred, as I mentioned, the vaccine development program, in fact, the COVID program, as a light speed project and approach. But this is important to think, as we are moving fast, there are certain areas you don't cut corners. Safety is important, so that is not something that we want to cut any time on that. So it's important not to compromise the safety, scientific rigor, quality, and integrity. But as I showed you, where we cut things was where we did parallel manufacturing, because then it's a financial risk, because you don't know, right, what your pivotal study is going to show, but you're putting a financial risk of manufacturing before you had a chance to see what those pivotal studies show. So here is what we call the light speed paradigm. Is the main important thing is, as I mentioned, our partnership with BioNTech and our scientists coming together, following the scientists. So the science, the surveillance, and the scientific evidence. Why did we use the mRNA platform? How do we use it? What is the science telling us? The parallel testing is also important because at the beginning, when you do a design, we had different constructs, but we needed to test them in parallel instead of wait, let's see if this works. Okay, that doesn't work, let's go to A, B, and C, but we would have multiple ways of testing in parallel, and then also use our expert scientists and clinicians to really optimize the dose that we want to choose. Dose optimization is also another important. Then there is the importance of streamlined governance. This is one that is really critical, is like empowering the team that is really close to the science, close to the evidence, and making sure that we tell our teams that safety and quality and integrity are a must in everything that we do. And first thing, there is, as I mentioned, the parallel thing is then we have to also think financially, what are the things that we can really take risk, like the manufacturing, the commercial that we had to do. Another important thing, of course, we don't work in silo. We have to work with our regulators. We have to be able to communicate that in real time, and that was also something that was done. We were not the only ones working fast. They also needed to work fast to accommodate what was happening, and they also needed to respond to us. So they also had their own light speed way of working, and this is why we had to make sure we were aligned in terms of the workflow. I mentioned about the behavior. So while moving at the speed of science, it's also important that there are considerations. I think, as I met, it's very important to understand the greatest unmet need. In this case, we were faced with the pandemic, so no one will disagree that this was the greatest unmet need. Substantial time reduction. So we look and we think about where is the white space? Where is the time that we could really save this time? Because every minute, every week, every day, every month, every year, more patients are dying. And so the other thing is we need to think about the breakthrough potential. We need to think about what are the things that we want to work, what are the types of platforms, what are the types of science we really want to take because it can provide that breakthrough potential and make a significant impact. The light speed habits, as I mentioned, is while we're moving at the speed of science, we need to make sure always focusing. Quality is important, safety is important. Those are the things that we don't want to compromise. And then there is this thing that we call eliminate bureaucracy, or we call it cutting red tape, because I will give you an example. We used to have, somebody who reports to me, we would have a pre-meeting to a pre-meeting to a meeting. So we needed to avoid certain of these things and make sure that there is really, we're getting to the work that is efficient. We really needed to build an efficiency and align also priorities across the enterprise. And it's not just science that take us from that concept of discovery to get it translated and to get it to really the patients. There is multiple other people that work with us that are enabling function, whether it's the people who help us with our budget, where are the people who develop our talent, whether it is the other ones, like as I mentioned, the digital. We needed to really align on that and make sure that we are all facing and going in the same direction. Additional lessons that we learned, and it has been really covered this morning, it was very important also for us to build digital resilient trial system. As I mentioned, digital tools became very important for us. We needed to go to where patients are. It was no longer that we would have the same clinical sites. We needed to make sure we have a decentralized. We needed to make sure that our clinical trials are diverse, that they are serving the needs of the patients and the individuals that we want to protect and that we want to treat. So that was also very important, and that in itself had its own transformational journey. Another thing it was important is also it's not only that we have, it's very important that we have innovation in our science, whether it's our vaccines and treatments, but we need to make sure those vaccines become vaccinations, that they are reaching the individuals that need them the most. And thinking about the equitable access. And we heard that, in terms of health equity, what COVID did is really basically unleashed what was already underlined. So we really need to address that. Number one is the things that, of course, our clinical trials are very important in terms of how we do them. So we have to make sure we diversify them, that we have improved representation, that we enhance, as I mentioned, these digital technologies even to reach places that we have not been, and sharing our knowledge. This was also important that we were getting as we were doing these trials, it's important for us also to share the data. So I will give a few examples of the health equity highlights, as I mentioned, because it's important for us to address this, but it starts also with our people. So how do we diversify our workforce? How do we train the next generation, whatever that might be? And there is the classical, of course, the traditional way, but we're also trying to look at non-traditional ways where we have breakthrough fellowship programs for underserved populations. Another one that we added recently was also a refugee leadership initiative where Pfizer has made commitment to hire certain numbers. Here it says 150 refugees by 2020. We've already started to do that as well. The other one is our science. So we have our people and our science. We need to make sure that we can translate it. We need to make sure that we have commitment to diversify not only our clinical trial, but also our science. In terms even starting with health equity early on in our discovery, and how do we really bring that? You know, I love, you know, as a physician scientist, I always think of bench to bedside, but from bedside to bench, thinking about this 360 process, where we in fact launched the Institute of Translational Equitable Medicine last year in November of 2021. So we would have health equity built in, whether it's our pipeline, everything that we do that is built in every process that we do. Another one is how do we make our medicines, vaccines accessible? And I mentioned a few, and a few of that is to really work the private-public partnership, partnering with other pharmaceutical manufacturing sites, as I mentioned, in South Africa, the other one in Latin America, in Brazil. And recently, we launched an Accord for a Healthier World. And where this is to address the inequities that exist from wealthy countries to the low-income countries is to make sure that our innovative, novel, all our medicines are accessible. So this is something that we launched and working to work with many lower income countries. So moving on in terms of looking where we are currently, as of August 2022, this plot just shows that vaccine distribution in about 180 countries and territories. And we're continuing to work how to make sure that, you know, our vaccines can be accessed worldwide. And I will go to one of my last two slides. This one is Paxlovid, also making sure that our commitment towards equitable access of Paxlovid, the treatment for COVID-19, is we, in fact, Pfizer signed a medicine patent pool voluntarily. So there is 36 sub-licenses that have signed. This is allowing generic companies to make a generic component of Paxlovid. And you'll see here there is many sub-licenses here pending to the authorization. Of course, the countries have to authorize it, but this is something that we are doing. There are other things also that we are doing. We just recently also contributed to the Global Fund. This is WHO strategy, as well as with UNICEF to make Paxlovid available to low-income countries. And then there is also other ones that we have, the COVID Start Treat program, part of the Accord of Healthier World, is to make it also accessible to low-income countries. So there is also funding that goes out, because in order to be on Paxlovid, you need to be tested. You need to have that PCR. So making sure also that we contribute to that. So this is my last slide. There is also the Pfizer Foundation. This is a global health strategy that focuses on 3 pillars to help improve access, particularly in those that are historically underserved communities. One of the pillars is to address infectious diseases, and this is providing grants and programs, and there is a few of them mentioned here to address infectious disease burden and threats worldwide. The second pillar is global health innovation grants, where it's provided to support 20 social enterprises and health entrepreneurs in low-middle income countries, and health delivery to advance innovation. And there's a few mentioned here. And our humanitarian response, this is targeted response to global humanitarian crises as they appear, is for us also to be involved and to contribute to these agencies that are have long-term humanitarian and refugee needs. With that, I will end here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aida, for this very interesting presentation. Now it's time for questions. Are there any questions in the audience or online? Yeah, there's the mic.
Sauerborn of Heidelberg University. Thank you very much, Aida, for a wonderful presentation. I have maybe a slightly awkward question. You talk about the Pfizer vaccine. Of course, there was BioNTech, both on the scientific discovery, drug discovery, vaccine discovery side, and also in the manufacturing. Where is the cooperation? Where do you draw the line between these two entities in your wonderful lightning speed operation?
Where I divide, perhaps you can, where I divide the cooperation?
Yes, with BioNTech, you know,
yes.
the Mainz-based, Germany-based company,
yes.
with whom you were in a cooperation, a consortium to develop and to
yes.
manufacture the vaccine.
Yes.
You didn't mention them at all.
The BioNTech, I call it Pfizer BioNTech. No, I did mention them. In fact, in 2020, it shows the hand with the, I can go back to the slide. Yeah, yes, no, of course. This is one of the most important partnerships. I think I did mention it.
But what's the separation of tasks and the
who
see. Did what? That was my question.
Oh, I see what you mean. So this is why I think the partnership is very important. So the scientists need to come together, and I think that cooperation, of course, I think this is what I meant to empower. When you empower, like giving the scientists to work together. So when we think about development, right, in an R&D process, we have to do all those phase trials together. But of course, who does what? It has to be given to the people that are, making sure that we are aligned, and we continue to do that. Who's going to do what? That's really left to the people who are, because there is so many layers, right? There is also, for example, the safety. Who's going to do the safety monitoring? Who's going to do the clinical trials? So that was really distributed based on the resources that we have. Who could do it better, right? Would it be better but it was a partnership, and that's why it worked really well. And we have more partnership, in fact, that we are working on other things as well, because we learned that we work really well. We want to continue to do that.
Thank you. There's another question.
Paxlovid appears to be very efficient. But after a few days, at least some patients again get symptoms. What is the reason? Pharmacokinetic reason or pharmacodynamic reason?
Thank you for that question. So with regards to Paxlovid, what you're describing is what has been reported as the rebound effect. And so the rebound effect is something that, at least in a controlled study, when we look at our EPIC-HR, for example, when we look at, because that is blinded. So it's a very controlled study. So you have people that didn't get the treatment and people that had the Paxlovid. What we saw was actually in small percentage of, handful percentage of individuals who took Paxlovid or placebo. It happened in both. So both the placebo as well as in the treatment, telling us that this rebound is not really because of the treatment. And then there is also an NIH study that I think it was in preprint, at least the last time I looked at it, which looked at all the placebo, which means not only Paxlovid, but there are other studies that have been done, of course, to look at this. Whether patients are not treated, you also see that rebound, which is telling us it may be a natural history in terms of how the virus, how we clear. It also probably is dependent, I'm sure, the host response, how we remove that virus. But it's related in terms of how the viral replication comes back, and then the host immune response probably gets rid of it. But we are seeing it in both. So we cannot really attribute it to pharmacodynamics or kinetics related to the therapy, because it seems it's happening in both the placebo and also in the treatment arm. So it's probably a natural history. We need to understand how this actually, the host immune response, and how we really clear the virus.
Thank you very much. Are there additional questions? Yes.
I'm not sure whether you can or are allowed to answer these questions, but if you are allowed, I would be interested how Pfizer is positioning itself with the patent infringement that was put to court by Moderna.
Right. So we are talking about some legal action from Moderna. I don't have a knowledge about that, not necessarily because I can respond or not, is because it's something that, you know, the legal system is still trying to understand what that is about. So I don't have really much knowledge on that. I think I just know what you know, what is being really reported out there.